This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So we're now going into another area which, as someone who was born and raised as a Methodist in the UK, I'm particularly interested to hear about the British missions and the making of Brazilian Protestantism. I'm also fascinated by the timescale in your research project up to 1962, where certainly maybe other forms of Protestantism were beginning to take off there. But we'll hear it all from you. And Pedro is a PhD student in history at the University of Cambridge, and he is carrying out this research project about Protestants and the public sphere in Brazil, 1874 to 1962, under the supervision of Professor David Maxwell. And we're looking forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Alan Charlton, and thank you very much, Professor Linda Nilsson, as well, for letting me to present this work today. Throughout the 19th century, most of the Protestant missions active in Brazil were American-based denominational organizations, especially the Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists as well. The establishment of these missions in the country followed especially the migration of Southern Confederates to São Paulo, Bahia, and Pará by the time of the American Civil War. However, British missions also occupied a relevant place in the making of Brazilian Protestantism, especially through the work of Scottish Congregationalists in Rio de Janeiro and the activity of non-sectarian organizations such as the British and Foreign Bible Society and the Religious Tract Society. Under the impulse of early 19th century evangelicalism, lay converts to Protestantism were recruited to act either as evangelists or as co-porters in the missionary work. So in this presentation today, my focus will draw especially on these efforts headed by British missions in Brazil, especially the non-sectarian British missions. Most of the studies on British missions in Brazil have focused on the central role played by the couple of Scottish missionaries, Robert and Sarah Calley, in the development of Brazilian Protestantism. The foundation of the first evangelical church in Rio de Janeiro, the Igreja Evangélica Fluminense, in 1858, and the organization of Sunday schools from 1855 onwards, are listed among the couple's main contributions to the making of Brazilian Protestantism. Emile Leonard and Davi Gueiros Vieira, two historians, have shown how the missionary work of Robert Calley raised the issues of religious toleration and the limits of religious freedom in post-independence Brazil. By means of his political and diplomatic contacts, Calley was able to get support from British diplomats and Brazilian jurists who defended the Protestants' rights to do public meetings and the evangelistic work in the country as well. In a different way, the American historian Richard Graham has argued that the idea of individual salvation introduced by British missionaries in Brazil represented a rupture against the communitarian notions of traditional Catholicism in the country. And he also argued that these represented forms of modernization of Brazil. Finally, in a more recent study published in 2009, the Brazilian literary theorist João Leonel has shown how the translation of the classical British nonconformist novel The Pilgrim's Progress exerted a relevant influence in Protestant communities, especially in the 19th century. According to Leonel, the book translated by Robert Calley was conceptualized as a shadow Bible, or a guide to the reading of the Bible, or an introduction to the reading of the Bible. Taking a different route here, I want to analyze in this presentation how the production and dissemination of Bibles and Christian literature advanced by British Protestant organizations were shaping 19th century Brazilian Protestantism. Two missionary organizations that kept close connections with the Fluminense Evangelical Church in Rio de Janeiro will be analyzed here. The British and Foreign Bible Society, the BFBS, and the Religious Tract Society, the RTS. The operations of both the BFBS and the RTS in Brazil began in the mid-1850s. These two societies became progressively entangled with the Fluminense Evangelical Church of Rio de Janeiro throughout the 19th century especially. Although initiating its works in Brazil in 1856, the BFBS only developed a systematic, continuous, and broad business in Brazil in 1865 after the appointment of a Scottish Episcopal pastor called Richard Holden as the superintendent of the society. By the time of Holden's nomination as the superintendent, the BFBS was already a sexagenarian institution operating at global level and connecting the British Isles to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The BFBS translated, printed, and revised and circulated as well one single book, the Bible, or portions of the Bible, such as the New Testament, or the Gospel separately, or the book of Psalms. Due to its non-sectarian character, all prefaces, explanatory notes, or interpretations of biblical verses were strictly forbidden in all books printed by the society. Furthermore, after a polemic involving English Puritans and Scottish Presbyterians in 1825, all apocryphal books and chapters were excluded from the versions printed by the British Informed Bible Society. Two translations of the Bible in Portuguese were published by the BFBS in the 19th century. First of all was the 18th century translation from the Vulgate by the Catholic priest Antônio Pereira de Figueiredo, and the second was the 17th century translation from the original texts, Hebrew and Greek, by João Ferreira de Almeida, which had several problems of language, and the missionaries complained a lot about it. So this is an image of the headquarters of the British and Foreign Bible Society in Blackfriars. Between 1865 and 1911, three men supervised the BFBS work in Brazil. Richard Holden, from 1865 to 1872, José Martim de Carvalho, who was his bookkeeper previously from 1872 to 1879, and the Brazilian Reverend João Manuel Gonçalves dos Santos, who was trained in London and acted as the BFBS superintendent from 1879 to 1911. All of them were members of the Fluminense Evangelical Church, founded by Robert Calley in Rio de Janeiro. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, these superintendents laid the groundwork of the BFBS work in Brazil. The main strategy adopted in Brazil was also the society's modus operandi in other parts of the world, the selling of Bibles and Christian literature from door to door. This strategy was known as colportage, and these men, for example, this was one of the society's colporters working in the province of Goiás, called Camilo. The society's superintendents usually employed fixed colporters for the work of Bible selling in the more populated regions of Brazil. Two or more colporters worked simultaneously in the province of Rio de Janeiro, while in Rio Grande do Sul, Bahia, and Pernambuco, for example, only one colporter was responsible to cover each province. They also made some trips to the countryside of these provinces, or try to expand the domains of the British Informed Bible Society in different provinces of the country as well. In São Paulo and Campinas, American Presbyterian missionaries corresponded with the society and employed their own colporters to disseminate the BFBS Bibles. Furthermore, the superintendents also hired colporters for short periods from 1 month to 6 months. These men usually traveled extensively through less populated provinces, verifying the possibilities of establishing new workstations of the BFBS. Most of these colporters, acting on behalf of the society, were recruited among Brazilian converts to Protestantism. Few of them were foreign colporters. They were also men of very modest and simple training. In his annual report of 1872, the superintendent Carvalho, commenting about the work of one of his colporters, Manuel dos Anjos, wrote that he was a man of very little instruction, but that little instructed men are usually better than the learned to take the work of Jesus Christ. Furthermore, in a letter sent to the Society's secretary in November 1875, Carvalho mentioned that few of his co-porters were able to write, and that recruiting co-porters with better training was a very difficult task. Not only did co-porters sell Bibles or portions of the Bible in their long trips through the Brazilian provinces, they also carried other kinds of Christian literature in their boxes and bags. Part of these books were published under the auspices of the Religious Tract Society of London. Differently from the BFBS and the American Tract Society, its counterpart based in New York, the RTS decentralized the process of printing and publication of texts. Instead of carrying out most of the printing work in London, the Society's committee sent grants, money basically, to their agents around the missionary field. These agents were responsible for sending the text to local publishing houses and finding the means to disseminate these texts in their countries of residence. Interestingly, the Religious Tract Society connected Brazil and Portugal by means of circulation of Protestant literatures from the 1860s onwards. Texts either written or translated by Robert Calley in Rio de Janeiro were printed in Lisbon and circulated across different regions of the Lusophone world. Here you can see some of these pamphlets that were published by the Religious Tract Society. All of them were printed in London, in Lisbon actually, sorry, but they circulated in Brazil. In most of the Protestant communities, these texts were usually read aloud because most of the Brazilian Protestants were illiterate themselves. So more than having publics, these texts also had actually audiences in the 19th century especially. Other pamphlets, especially those that stressed the extraordinariness of the Bible, reacted against Catholic critiques of Protestant Bibles that echoed in both sides of the Atlantic. Two fundamental elements of 19th century evangelicalism can be observed here. First of all, the involvement of lay people in the missionary work. Not only were the BFBS and the RTS works financially sustained by common Christian men and women who purchased subscriptions for these societies at home. In the missionary work, in the missionary field actually, lay people also get very closely involved with the work of evangelism and colportage. Secondly, the work carried out by these societies was influenced by the 19th century evangelical ideal actually, that both the Bible and other Christian texts possessed extraordinary power and authority. Texts in these missionary theories of language operated as noiseless messengers or non-human agents that could penetrate regions where missionaries themselves could not go. These ideals that attributed magic notions of textual agency to the Bible also circulated across the missionary movement in the Lusophone world. This pamphlet, printed in Lisbon in 1897 and sold by the Evangelical Library in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, entitled Eu Não Compreendo a Bíblia, I Do Not Understand the Bible, affirmed that the biblical text was partly unintelligible because the Bible was a heavenly book and human beings are earthly creatures. Its perfect language would not be fully understood by men and women, and the pamphlet recommended that all believers should pray to the Holy Spirit as an inhabitant of the heaven to help them in their study of the Bible. However, more than only prompting individual conversions, these missionaries and Brazilian Protestants believed that literacy and the Bible were instruments for social moralization and civilization as well, civilization of nations. In a letter sent to the governor of Córdoba, Argentina in 1871, Richard Holden wrote about this feature of the Protestant books. I quote him in this passage. The book, which I have the honor to place in your Excellency's hand, is God's book. the book which has exerted the deepest, most widespread, and most salutary influence on the character and progress of the human race. Experience has abundantly shown that piety, morality, civilization, and liberty attend to its dissemination, and that no greater blessing can be given to a nation than an open Bible as a fountain from which the national mind may draw healthful instruction and vigorous moral principles. The Bible, in this sense, would meet the needs of emerging nation states in Latin America. I'm sorry for this awfully busy table here, but this is an interesting table that shows figures of circulation of Bibles and Testaments and portions in Brazil between 1870 and 1898. I want to call our attention here to one aspect of this table. It is possible to see that the overall selling of portions of the Bible, especially Gospels and the book of Psalms, outnumber the amount of Bibles that were sold by the society. It represented more than 60% of all sales done by the British and Foreign Bible Society in Brazil. But you can see a trend in these figures as well, like a sort of inversion of this trend. So in the beginning, more Bibles were sold than Testaments and portions, but especially from 1879 onwards, portions of the Bible were more purchased by Brazilians. So there is one question here. Why did Brazilians purchase more portions and testaments than Bibles? There are some answers, but to summarize here, I want to focus on only two of these answers. First of all, outbreaks of yellow fever and economic crisis in Brazil. Outbreaks of yellow fever in Rio de Janeiro were among the most frequently mentioned elements that limited the circulation of Bibles and books in Brazil in the correspondences between colporteurs and the headquarters of the Bible Society in London. Some colporteurs were infected by the disease. Some of their family members died of the disease, such as Carvalho's brother in 1876, and many steamships that arrived in Rio de Janeiro were forced to go through quarantine, which delayed the Bible transaction in Brazil. Furthermore, the yellow fever also affected the urban dynamic of Rio de Janeiro and the people's financial conditions. Financial shortages caused either by outbreaks of diseases or economic crises, such as the agrarian crisis of Pernambuco in 1873, usually affected negatively the distribution of Bibles in Brazil. After being asked by the BFBS committee in 1876 whether he could employ more colporteurs, the superintendent Carvalho argued that as the economic crisis of 1870s had raised dramatically the cost of living in the country, the selling of Bibles was decreasing, and it was not wise to appoint new colporteurs at that time. Manuel dos Anjos, a very active colporteur working in Rio de Janeiro, mentioned in his report of 1872 that most of his books were sold among fishermen, black sailors, and poor workers who could not afford the Bibles printed by the society in times of scarcity. These men purchased mostly portions and testaments, but not the whole of scriptures. One of the leading principles that guided the BFBS work at home and abroad was that their books should be sold as cheaply as possible. This cheapness, though, was subjected to variations of inflation rates and economic fluctuations in Brazil. Secondly, one of the most mentioned, actually this was the most frequently mentioned element that limited the circulation of Bibles in Brazil, was the reaction, especially of Catholics, against the circulation of Bibles. This was the factor most frequently mentioned in the correspondence between the BFBS staff in Brazil and the headquarters in London. In 1862, the Archbishop of Bahia, Dom Manuel Joaquim da Silveira, reacting against the work of a Spanish colporteur of the society in that province, wrote a pamphlet against the Almeida's translation of the Bible. In his analysis, the Protestant Bible had been adulterated and mutilated, and all Catholics should avoid either reading these versions or purchasing any kind of Protestant books. This publication prompted a very strong reaction against the so-called English Bibles in different parts of the country. The event was known as the polemic of false Bibles. And here you can see the cover of one of these pamphlets. Actually, this was a comment on the pamphlet written by Dom Manuel Joaquim da Silveira. The message of this pamphlet reverberated widely in Brazil, Latin America, and in Lusophone countries in the 19th century, in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In several occasions, Brazilian colporteurs were impeded or blocked by public authorities to sell Bibles from door to door under the assumption that they were selling false books. In the 1870s and 1880s, the ultramontane periodical published in Rio de Janeiro, O Apóstolo, started to call all Protestants by the offensive term Os Bíblias. Some of these reactions against Protestant Bibles were also reinterpreted in the popular mind. The Superintendent João dos Santos, in his report of 1892, mentioned that he met some people in Rio de Janeiro who were afraid of the consequences of reading books disseminated by the society. In 1874, a colporteur called Viana, who was working in Pernambuco, mentioned that some people in the city of Nazaré showed him a young man who had lost his reason as he was reading the false books of Protestants and Freemasons. As can be seen here, not only Protestants themselves regarded religious texts as extraordinary agents that could prompt unaided conversions. In the development of the polemic of false Bibles, the BFBS colporteurs also encountered popular reactions against Protestant books that also attributed to texts the magical powers of enchantment. So coming to a conclusion, I just want to highlight two things. First of all, an issue of agency. Though most studies on Brazilian Protestantism attach a sense of foreignness to the new religion, a careful study on British missions operating in 19th century Brazil show that the most active disseminators of the new faith were Brazilian converts. Colporteurs and evangelists were able to find spaces for themselves in the expanding bureaucracies of missionary societies and engage in the proselytizing work, the evangelistic work. Christian societies such as the BFBS not only enabled the engagement of lay people in the evangelistic work, but they were also platforms for negotiation of working conditions and salaries. These institutions represented, in this sense, opportunities for upward social mobility in the Protestant realm in Brazil. Finally, the establishment of new transatlantic connections in the making of Brazilian Protestantism. Both the BFBS and the RTS extended their work to a global scale in the 19th century. The creation of missionary circuits and networks opened the space to the establishment of sub-connections. Isabel Hofmeyr, in a very interesting book, has emphasized how south-south flows of Christian literature characterized the field of missionary work in Africa as much as the north-south flows from Europe and the United States to African and Latin American countries. So in this sense, these missionary institutions can be understood as conduits or pipelines that connected different regions of the world and enabled some sub-connections as well. Thank you very much.